All right, everybody. So welcome back to, I guess this is episode 2 of my recordings for the intro to the multi-IFR department. Specifically, this lesson is going to be focusing on intro to IFR training. And this should apply for whether you're doing training in the IFR department towards your on-wing Group 1 or Group 3 training, but it will also apply for recurrent training with regards to an IPC, where you're just jumping in the simulator and you're getting there in practice, and then you do a recurrent ride, and then Bob's your uncle, you're good for another 2 years, so to speak. So there should be a considerable amount of overlap, and no matter which way you're going, it should apply for both. So nice. We'll start with the presentation here. It should walk us through nicely the regulatory side of things, and then we'll kind of get into the logistics of what you can expect on something like a flight test and how we're going to conduct the training. So the first thing here, that's a picture of the Piper Seneca. So that's what we're going to be using to do the on-wing training for the Group 1. And just as a quick kind of breakdown, Group 1 is a multi IFR rating where you got the two engines kind of not on the center line. Group 2 is centerline thrust multi-engine, so like a Cessna 337 Skymaster where you've got the push-pull propellers. By the way, my cat Piper is going to be very annoying today because she's hungry and she's going to be bugging me for about the next hour for food. So we'll learn to work around her. Group 3 is going to be the single engine IFR rating. And I think Group 4 is helicopters, which we're not going to do anything like that. Now, down you go. When it comes to doing your initial rating for the IFR, whether it's Group 1, Group 3, whatever it happens to be, you have to do it on wing. So if you're going for your initial IFR, it has to be done on an actual aircraft. You can only do an IFR renewal in the simulator. Now, that's not to say we still do make use of the IFR, the simulator. A couple of things to be aware of is that it's mostly used for a procedural trainer and getting your scans down and getting your procedures down for how to operate the aircraft in IMC conditions. It doesn't behave very similar to the way that the actual, my screen is frozen. That's awesome. All right, I think I'm back now. It doesn't behave the same way that the actual aircraft does. The Seneca is a very heavy aircraft. You have to be very deliberate with your actions on it to get it to move either to climb or descend or to turn. Whereas the simulator is very pitch sensitive, and it's just something we'll have to learn to live with, basically. But anyway, so we're going to start the presentation here. So things that we're going to cover today are going to be what's necessary to obtain an IFR rating. And just coming back to that idea of the groups of IFR, is that whatever group you have, it automatically falls down and gives you provides you the ability to do the group below you. So if I have a Group 1 multi-engine IFR, it means I can do the Group 2 centerline thrust and a single engine IFR operations. If I have the Group 2, and most people don't go for the Group 2, they just go for the Group 1 or the Group 3. But if you have the Group 2, it does apply also to a single engine. And if you have a Group 3, that's all you get. Nothing, and none of those apply to the helicopter, by the way. So but that's how it basically works. So we'll talk about the requirements to obtain an IFR rating. We're going to talk about the use of checklists. And generally speaking, when it comes to IFR multi-training specifically, but any kind of training you're doing in general, the more you say, the better. And it's not a requirement. Like if you're in a real emergency and you need to do like a shutdown procedure, whatever, you don't have to talk your way through it. Although I will find it makes it easier because it just comes automatically and you're talking yourself through your own drill. But it helps your instructor understand kind of where you are in terms of your reasoning and your decision making, and it helps the examiner kind of assess your skill level too. So the more you talk in the cockpit, the better it's going to be. And this is kind of where, if there's something that's missed as you're talking, then as an instructor or as an examiner, we can kind of point out and say, here's maybe a way that you can improve that skill to make things a little bit better. We'll talk about the simulator operation. Specifically, we do have a Redbird FMX simulator here at the Regina Flying Club, which is very useful. It can be configured for either a multi-engine or a single engine configuration. We can set it up either as a G1000, a glass cockpit, or in the classic dial instrumentation. We call it the 6-pack. The limitation for the G1000 is, unfortunately, the simulator is unable to simulate G1000 single engine. So you can only do a G1000 multi-engine in the simulator. And I mean, it still works fine. I mean, as far as the operations from the pilot's perspective goes, it's more or less the same. We just won't be doing engine failure scenarios if you're just going for the Group 3 instead. We'll talk about lesson plans, some things that we're going to cover, generally speaking, and how we would log things if it's a simulator. This presentation here is focused mostly on the simulator, but I'm going to be talking about other stuff as we go along here. Why is this important? Because you want to be a safe and effective pilot. It says this is kind of aimed more towards the professional pilot side of things, but if you're not going for a professional rating, that's still fine. This will still be very useful for your purposes, but it's kind of tailored in that direction. But more specifically, it's about keeping safe. And the first thing I'll tell you about an IFR rating is that you want to be able to highlight to the examiner that there's a difference between whatever your legal limits are, your legal minimums, but also your personal minimums, because your personal minimum should always be at a higher standard than the legal minimums, just to keep yourself safe. And at the end of the day, that's what the examiner is looking for. That's what the instructor is looking for. We don't want to cut you loose and send you out in the world and have you find yourself in a situation that is over your head. And we say that experience is what you get when you find yourself in a situation that experience would have kept you out of. And unfortunately, I mean, experience is something that has to be built over time, but we want to give you, through the benefit of our training, as much good advice as we can so that these situations don't come up. Privileges, I already talked about all that stuff. So Group 1 instrument rating allows the pilot to fly all single and multi-engine non-high performance. So that's less than, I believe the cutoff is, it used to be by horsepower, but it's by airspeed now. So I think if your stall speed is more than 80, and if your never exceed speed is more than 250, I think, for high performance. I could be wrong on those ones. But as long as you're not within those restrictions, you should be fine. In instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, under instrument flight rules, a private pilot license or commercial pilot license can be endorsed with an instrument rating. So you don't have to have your commercial pilot license to do your training. So I've been working with guys lately who they've done their PPL, their night rating, and then right away going into their multi and IFR. Now, it does make it a little more challenging because the learning curve is going to be much more steep. If you get that commercial pilot license under your belt before you get the multi IFR, it does make things a little bit easier for you. That said, if you do your multi training while you're in your time building towards a commercial, the dual time that you do as part of your multi and IFR training does contribute towards your overall CPL flight test requirements, your CPL license requirements. So that is a nice advantage to doing both because there's overlap there. Talked about the 4 different groups, and yeah, at least you still need to have at least a PPL. We can't do multi or IFR training until you get at least that. So the IFR rating program is separated into 2 related but separate paths. There's ground school and air instruction. Now, the ground school, I've already kind of made a video that focuses on the groundwork that you can cover in the flight test. So for focusing on the questions that the examiner can ask. That's not to say that this presentation is designed to give you the knowledge to write the INRAT written exam. So the instrument rating TC written exam that you have to go to either Saskatoon or whatever your nearby exam location would be. That's not the purpose of this exam or of this presentation, because there's a lot more detailed knowledge that goes into that. That's kind of beyond the scope of what we're trying to cover here. Ground school will furnish you with the required ground-based background knowledge and understanding to successfully challenge the written examination, while the air instruction will provide you with the skills required to succeed the flight test. Now, if you are looking for a good resource to do your INRAD exam for ways to study, I do recommend pilottraining.ca. I get no money for recommending that. It's just what I use personally, and I found it's a nice online course which I found effective towards getting me prepared for the IFR written exam. And you will need to be at least 17 years of age in order to do your IFR rating. All pilots are required to have a medical certificate. There are 4 categories of medical certificates. The process of obtaining a certificate will differ depending on your category and your age. Now, for those of you if you're going towards a career as a pilot, a category 1 medical certificate is what you'd want to get. If you're just going to be doing this for personal private use, category 3 is fine. And the one thing to point out is that an IFR rating in the past used to expire. There was a certain validity period, and the rating would expire. So if you are one of those guys that had an IFR rating way back in the day, I think before 2005 is when they changed this, your aviation document booklet, that little blue passport looking thing, your pilot license might indicate an expiry date for your IFR. So the first thing you need to do before you actually begin your training is that you need to call Transport Canada up, and you need to get them to reissue a new sticker that your aviation document booklet no longer shows an expiry on your instrument rating. If the expiry date is still shown there, we are unable to do your recurrent rating until that's been rectified. So it's a legal, technical requirement that you need to have done before you start your training. I mean, we can do your training, but you just can't do the ride. So get it done first, because it's going to take a couple of weeks to kind of get that sticker in the mail. And the exam fees are between $100 and $150. That's if you're lucky. I've had exams in some places up to $300. It's not cheap to be a pilot. Here's the requirements to get your IFR rating. And this course is specifically, this presentation specifically towards the IFR. I'm going to be making mention of the multi-rating throughout, but the purpose of this is the IFR. So knowledge: an applicant shall have obtained a minimum of 70% on the Transport Canada written exam, which is the INRAT. For experience, you need to have at least 50 hours of cross-country flight time as pilot in command. So even though you just finished your night rating, you still have to be doing your time building to get yourself towards that requirement. 40 hours of instrument time, of which a maximum of 20 hours may be ground instrument time. So 40 hours total, and you will have 20 hours total by the time you finish your night rating. So that's good. That's half of that knocked out. And likely you would not have more than half of that as well as ground sim time. So at max, when you finish your night rating, it would be about 10 hours of sim time. So we will use as much of the sim as we can, because it's, first of all, it's cheaper for you, which is a nice thing. So instead of paying, you know, $350 an hour, whatever it is, to rent the twin to go flying and practice this stuff, might as well do it for $150 an hour in the sim. Those prices may have changed by the time you watch this video, so I'm not guaranteeing that those are the prices. So it's cheaper doing the sim. Now, what we would normally do is that we would train you in the simulator up to the 20-hour mark for the ground sim time, and then we jump in the plane and get going to basically round out what's left, which would usually be another 10 hours total to get you that 40. However, if we do find we need a little more practice in the simulator, then we'll stay there. We'll do what we need. There is some differences between the simulator and the actual aircraft in terms of things like the GPS unit is going to be a bit of a difference. And what I recommend as well is that there is, if you're going to be doing on-wing multi-IFR training, we have a Garmin 650 GPS in the twin. And if you want practice with that before you get in there, to be familiar with how the GPS is kind of laid out, there is an iPad app for that. It's called GTN Trainer, Golf Tango November Trainer. It's not free. I want to say it's around, I don't know, $5 to $10 or something like that. But for the familiarity that it provides for you before you begin your training would be really nice. The other thing you can do as well, if you've been training in the single engine department with the Regina Flying Club, is that you can fly in Fox Whiskey November. And that 172 does have a similar GPS. So if you can get comfortable with that, then it just makes the transition into the twin a little bit easier. The GPS, the Garmin GPS that's in the simulator is a Garmin 430, I believe, a 430 to 530, I think is what they're called. So there will be some adjustment getting used to the new one. The big difference is one is a touchscreen. The one in the twin is a touchscreen, and the one in the simulator is not. Otherwise, the functionality is pretty much the same. You will have to do one dual cross country under simulated or actual IMC conditions, and we're not going to really do it actual. We'll just do, you know, under the hood. So simulated conditions. Of a minimum of 100 nautical miles. And the way to interpret that is 50 nautical miles each direction. So 50 miles out, 50 miles back. And we actually use Yorkton as our cross country here. So I think it's 98 one way, 98 the other. It's a little bit longer. I think there was a cross country. I'll just look here in in my load chart. See if there was one that was like 48 miles away. Where was it? Was it Weyburn? There was some airport that was close to Regina, but it was too close to make this work, unfortunately. So the round trip would have been like 98 miles. So we can't do that. So that's why Yorkton was selected. And the nice thing about Yorkton too, I mean, even though it's twice as distant, basically, it's not that much longer in terms of how to fly the approaches. It's a 2-hour flight versus a 1.4, 1.5 it would be to go to Weyburn and back. The other thing, and my screen froze again, and I'll wait for it to come back. There we go. I hope the video doesn't freeze when that happens as well. But coming back to the cross country, is that nice thing about going to Yorkton is it gives you time to breathe. Basically, the one thing you'll find about doing IFR training is that it's continually a helmet fire. So you're always going to be departing, hold, approach, missed approach, another approach, and you're going to be really busy, and things are going to feel rushed all the time, and you're going to be very, I don't want to say fatigued, but you're always going to feel like you're playing catch up, and time management is going to be a big part of your IFR training. But it does get easier. Now, the nice thing about doing the cross country to Yorkton is it gives you time to breathe. And what I mean by that is that you just do a departure procedure and you look around and go, that's it. This is easy, right? And then it gives you like a good 20 minutes or so to prepare yourself for the approach that you're going to do at the destination. And that's going to be what it's really like under normal IFR conditions. Now, that's not to say there aren't the occasional helmet fires that happen in the commercial operations where it's a short hop and you've got lots of things to do. That definitely does take place. But for your first introduction into a cross country, it's a nice leisurely way of doing it. All right. An applicant shall successfully complete a flight test in accordance with the flight test standards, which makes sense. You have to do a flight test to do your IFR rating. And again, like I said, if it's your first time getting an IFR rating, you have to do it on wing. If it's going to be a renewal, you can do it in the simulator. The one thing I will say about the renewal, however, is that you have to do a couple of different exercises than the original flight test. So you basically do the full normal flight test that you would do. In addition to that, you're going to do 2 unusual attitude recoveries. So the situations where the instructor says, close your eyes, put your head down. They do some disorienting movements with the aircraft, and then they say, recover, you look up and you identify what's going on. If you can vocalize it, say nose high or nose low, and then do your recovery procedure as necessary. Just briefly, and it's later on the slide, but I'll mention it now, is that when it comes to the unusual attitudes, and again, this is only for an IPC, this is only for a renewal of an IFR rating. It does not happen on the initial. When you have an unusual attitude, you'll do one full panel, so you have access to all your instrumentation, and then the second one you'll do will be partial panel. So they'll use a view limiting device, like if you're a G1000, they might dim the screen, or they might fail some of the instruments, so you no longer have your artificial horizon on the display. And what else I was gonna say? Oh, and on the classic instruments, what they'll probably do, actually you would never do an unusual attitude on wing, because it's just cheaper to do it. If you're doing a recurrent, you might as well do it in the simulator. But if you want to do it on your plane, then we'd have to find some other way to kind of obstruct your view. So if it's just a piece of paper to cover up the instruments, then that's what we'll do. Or we have those little suction cups that we can put on the classic instruments as well. Anyways, for the unusual attitude, if you have a nose high embanked, we consider that to be like slow flight. So when you look up, the situation that you'd identify is that you have a nose up attitude, a decreasing airspeed, an increasing altitude. You may be turning as well. So what you would do is that you would vocalize nose high and then do your recovery procedure. Now, the recovery procedure for slow flight is power, attitude, trim. So you would apply full power, you're going to lower the nose, and then you're going to roll the wings level. So that's the important point. So I apply full power. And now when I'm applying full power in a single engine aircraft, it's just throttle to full. I'm not worried too much. Or let's say a single engine conventional propeller. If I have variable pitch propellers, which we will have in a multi-engine aircraft or a constant speed prop where I have a propeller lever, the thing you have to remember is that when you apply full power, you don't just shove the throttle all the way to full. You have to make sure your props are max first, because if your propellers are at a reduced RPM or at a coarse pitch and you go throttle to full, you're going to increase the speed of that propeller very rapidly, and you could overload the propeller and cause an over torque situation, and that would be damaging to the plane. So in slow flight, again, if I'm nose high and banked, then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to vocalize nose high and banked, and I'm going to go mixture full rich, propellers to max, throttles to full. That's how I'm going to protect my airspeed, by increasing the power. So I increase the power, and I'm going to lower the pitch attitude of the aircraft to the horizon first before I level the wings, because you might be in a nose high and banked attitude. But the thing that you have to remember, and I'll use a pen as an example here, is that my lift, basically, if this is my aircraft and my finger, my thumb, or my wings, this is my lift vector. So if I'm in a nose high and banked, if I roll the wings level immediately, I still have this lift that's pulling the plane into a further nose up attitude. So what you'll want to do is that when you have that unusual attitude, lower the nose first, then roll the wings level. And there will be a little bit of lift when you roll the wings level, but at least it's easier to manage. You're not as close to the stall. So that's what you would do in the unusual attitude nose high. Vocalize, mixture, pitch, power, lower the nose to the horizon, roll the wings level. You may have climbed through the beginning of that exercise as you did the unusual attitude recovery. They just really want to see the aircraft return to straight and level. You don't have to recapture your original altitude unless the examiner tells you to. Says, okay, exercise complete. I'll now get you back down to 5,000 feet or whatever your starting altitude was. On the other hand, if we have a nose low and banked unusual attitude, that's kind of the equivalent to spiral dives. So what you would do when you look up and you try to identify what's going on, you're going to see a rapidly increasing airspeed, possibly a nose down attitude, but not guaranteed, because sometimes if an instructor or examiner is really mean, they can put you in a kind of a steep banked nose up attitude. Eventually, if you let the situation progress, the nose will fall and then you'll end up in the spiral. So just because you have a nose high pitch attitude does not indicate for sure that you're actually I should say, in a slow flight situation. The aircraft could very rapidly deteriorate into a nose down unusual attitude. But anyways, in a normal nose down unusual attitude, you'll have increasing airspeed, rapidly decreasing altitude, probably high G factor. You hear a lot of wind noise, or the engine RPM could be at a high setting. All these kind of things that indicate that I'm nose low. So what I would do is I'd vocalize, say nose low, and then I do my recovery procedure. Now for this one, power is going to be first as well. It's like a spiral dive. It's throttle to idle, roll the wings level, and then ease out of the dive. Now, the interesting thing about this one is that when I bring the power idle, I don't have to worry about the mixtures or props on this one just yet, because bringing the power idle does nothing. I'm not going to hurt the engine by doing that. So power all the way to idle, roll the wings level distinctly, but we make sure you're confirmed level before you start pulling. We want to make sure that those are two distinct actions. There should be a roll, exercise, and then that maneuver is finished, and then there should be a pull. We never want to be twisting and pulling at the same time, because you could overstress the fuselage of the aircraft. As a bit of a thought experiment, just to prove this point, if you've ever taken, well, you probably haven't, but if you take an empty Coke can and you get two people to hold it on either end, you get one person to twist one end and you get another person to lift the other end. That's basically simulating what's happening in a spiral dive recovery when you're pulling and rolling at the same time. And what you're doing is that you're actually going to torque that tube. And if you do this, if you roll one end, which represents the aileron input, and then you lift one end, which represents the elevator input, that tin can will just shred right before you. So that's a nice kind of way to visualize why that's a bad idea to do those motions together. So roll first, and then bring the aircraft up. So I roll the wings level, I ease myself out of the dive, I set a gentle nose up attitude. And once I identify that my airspeed's bleeding off and it's now getting to a reasonable speed range, this is when I can consider increasing my power. Now, this is where, again, I'd have to go extra full rich, propellers to max, throttles to full if I want to establish a climb attitude. Now, and then you would return. Now, depending on the situation, you probably did lose a lot of altitude in that scenario. So we would want you to return to your starting altitude. So climb back up to where you started, and then you would level off at that point. So to kind of encapsulate the two procedures, no matter which unusual attitude you have, the first thing that should happen is out of your mouth should come the words nose high or nose low. The next thing that's going to happen is power. And whether it's nose high or nose low, you're going to either increase the power to full by mixture pitch power or throttle idle in a spiral dive. In the nose down, it's wings first, then pitch. For the nose high, it's pitch first and then wings level. So try to keep those two straight in your head if you can. But that's the, again, exercises on the IPC only. And like I said, we're going to do one that's going to be nose full panel, one's going to be partial panel. And the nice thing about this too is that if I can't say 100% of the time, but odds are that if the first one is a full panel that's nose high, then the second one that's going to be the partial panel would probably be the nose low. No guarantees, but he's going to want to see one of each, really, so it keeps it easy. And now, if you're in the G1000 for the partial panel recovery, again, we would fail the display, but you still have the standby instruments on the side to look at to identify what's going on. So that's great. You just look at your attitude indicator, really. And I kind of say that's bad advice because the attitude indicator could topple theoretically in a really extreme unusual attitude. So don't rely on that as your primary instrument source, but you should have the airspeed indicator and the altimeter to confirm what's going on. If you're doing the unusual attitude in the classic instrumentation with the 6-pack, then you'll probably have an attitude indicator failure and a heading indicator failure. So then you would look at your turn coordinator as your primary instrument to identify when the aircraft wings have leveled. And again, if you're going to be leveling yourself by reference only to the turn coordinator, center the ball on the inclinometer, or the ball on the turn coordinator, center it first, roll level, and then you can ease out of your dive, because the ball, if the ball's not centered, that turn coordinator is not indicating correctly. So that's the first thing you'd want to do. Anyways, continuing on here. Let's see, we talked about that. For the purposes of renewing an IFR rating, an instrument proficiency check may be completed in a flight simulation training device, and for us, that's the Redbird FMX, that is approved for instrument flight testing, including a conduct of a GPS or GNSS approach. And that means the same thing. GPS means global positioning systems, or global positioning satellites. I forget what the S actually stands for. And that's kind of the generic catch-all term for the any kind of satellite constellation. More specifically, GNSS stands for Global Navigation Satellite System, and that's the US run system. So GPS is generic, whereas GNSS is specifically the US system that they have based out of NORAD, I believe, in Colorado. So your simulator needs to be able to simulate that, and we have that ability, which is great. The instrument proficiency approach shall consist of all the normal items, and again, the two unusual attitudes, which I just talked about. I guess it was 2015 that the screen froze again. I'm having some fun with this display. I'll wait for it to come back. There we go. On September 16, 2015, a law was signed to exempt holders from an instrument rating exempt the holders of an instrument rating from the requirements that limited the validity period to 24 months. So it doesn't expire. However, there is a recency requirement. So if you haven't used your IFR rating for more than 2 years, I should say, it's gone beyond the first day of the 25th month, you are due for a training event. You cannot fly in IMC conditions or on an IFR flight plan without these without doing some kind of certification to prove that you have the flying skills to back up the license. So like I said here, your aviation document booklet must not show an expiry date on your instrument rating. If it does, just call TC and get them to issue another sticker. So every 2 years, you need to do something to prove your validity, to prove your skills, basically. And most professional pilots, they would do a pilot proficiency check, or PPC, which is basically a type rating, usually every 6 months or every year. But if you're going to be flying, general aviation for your own purposes, then jumping in our simulator would be a good way to do that. Now, if you do your initial IFR rating on wing and you pass your flight test, you are good to the first day of the 25th month. So the day I'm recording this is actually Valentine's Day today. And so if I did my flight test today, I would be good until March 1st of 2023. Now, if you're doing a renewal, so an IPC, your instrument rating at that time is then good date to date. It's not 2 years. It's not the first day of the 25th month. It's just 2 years total. So, 365 times 2. So then you'd be good to February 14th of 2023. Now, in the first 12 months after getting either your renewal refreshed or your initial rating, there's nothing really you need to do. You've proven your ability. First 12 months, you can pretty much do nothing and you'll be still certified IFR compliant. However, at the end of the first year, into the 13th month, basically, you then need to comply with something called the 6, 6, and 6 rule, where you have to prove, in order to fly IFR, that you've done 6 hours of instrument training and you've done 6 IFR approaches to minimums in the last 6 months. So if you can't prove that by pointing to something in your logbook, then you're no longer current. So then in order to get yourself current after that 12th month, then you would need to basically go into the simulator or go with an instructor and do those exercises, 6 hours of sim with 6 approaches. Now, to get around that rule, some guys actually get clever with that. Instead of doing a IFR rating IPC every 2 years, and that could take some time because after 2 years, you forget a lot of this stuff, and then it takes time to get back in the sim and get reacclimated, and a lot of briefing and a lot of sim time. Instead of doing that, what a lot of guys would do instead is every 1 year, every 12 months, just get back in the simulator. It's a little more fresh in your mind. It's a little bit easier to go in and prove your performance, and then you don't even have to worry about the 6, 6, and 6 rule anymore. So it's a nice way to kind of work around that if you find it more convenient. The IPC is a recurring recency event that confirms retention of a level of proficiency, meeting the standards of performance required for the issuance of an instrument rating, and demonstrates meeting the standards of the endorsement. It's a lot of words saying that you prove you have the skill. And I talked about everything else there, so I'm going to skip that. Saying that if you're doing your initial, you have to do it on wing. If you're doing a renewal, you can do it in the simulator. Oh, and when the examiner signs off your instrument rating, that's a temporary extension or temporary privilege. Basically, it's good for 90 days, and you need to get your sticker from Transport Canada within those 90 days in order to continue the rating. If it goes to day 91 and you don't have that sticker yet, your IFR, you can't fly IFR until you get that sticker. So make sure you keep an eye on the dates there. Use of checklists. So this is the thing I was saying earlier about talk as much as you can, because it helps me understand where you're at. And this is kind of good as well for the guys going to the airlines. The way that the checklists are run, this is kind of what we would do. So checklists will be read, used as necessary and read aloud. So you would say, before start checklist, I'm just mixture full rich, throttles to full, whatever they are, you read and then you do. When you get to the, if you get to the end of the checklist, then you would say, before start checklist complete, and then you go to the next checklist and you say after start checklist, and then you do that checklist as well. If you are interrupted mid checklist, hold your finger over the item not yet completed and say holding at mixtures or whatever the item happens to be, so that you don't forget where you are. Now, if you put the checklist down, your thumb's no longer on it, and you forget where you were on the checklist when you come back to things, start that checklist over. Start it right from the beginning because you don't want to miss something accidentally. Now, a requirement for the IPC, if you are going to be doing your renewal in the simulator, is that the simulator should be started from the hangar line, which means that basically a real point on the airport, the aerodrome, where you'll have to taxi out to the runway, and then you'll do your checks and everything, and then you'll take off and do your lesson. In practice, however, I believe that our examiner generally starts you from in position on the runway. So just understand there could be a difference there. We'll practice both scenarios as part of your simulator training if you're going to be doing the IPC. However, if you're going to do on wing training, then we'll usually just start in position on the runway because it's a little bit more efficient and it's just cheaper for the pocketbook. The reason why we do it in the IPC training is because it could come up on the flight test, and I want to make sure you're ready for it. Simulator training. So again, the simulator, the purpose of this is going to be a procedural trainer. We want to make sure that you got the skills down, specifically things like your situational awareness, your understanding of where you are, your briefings, your time management, and the basic elementary hand and feet flying skills to get you shooting approaches and doing things like that. We're not looking for perfection, but the common complaint from students I hear is that it's just really hard to hold altitude in the sim. It's very sensitive with the pitch. So I would say that in the simulator, the trim wheel is your friend. We have two trims basically in the simulator. We have one on the yoke, the electric trim, and we have the manual pitch trim wheel on the side. I would discourage use of the electric pitch trim on the yoke because it's almost too much. It will pitch you too aggressively. The only time where that might be useful is if you're doing an unusual attitude recovery and you don't have time from an extreme nose up or an extreme nose down attitude to get yourself trimmed with the wheel. So then maybe using the electric trim would be useful, but just be careful not to overdo it. The other thing about the simulator, I would say, is that with the trim, trim is going to be your best friend. If you can learn to use the trim effectively, that will make things really easy for you. The trim, or I should say, in the simulator, and this is kind of a negative teaching item actually on this, is that the vertical speed in the simulator doesn't act with a delay. So a vertical speed indicator on a real aircraft, there's about a 6-second delay from the point when you initiate a climb to when the vertical speed starts to show a reading. In the simulator, it almost acts like an IVSI, an instantaneous vertical speed indicator. So I would be keeping that vertical speed indicator a little bit more in my scan to identify when the aircraft begins to either start a climb or start a descent, because that'll be the first indication of either a nose up or a nose down attitude. So just be aware of that. Use of rudder should be at a minimum. I would only use rudder really in the simulator, at least when you have an engine failure scenario and need to correct for an engine failure. If you're just doing normal turns and things like that, I'd say you can leave your feet on the floor, generally speaking, because the rudder would almost be too much. Depending on the configuration, G1000 or classic 6-pack, you may also find the ailerons respond differently than what you're accustomed to, and it does differ between the two. I find the G1000 is a little more smooth with the aileron inputs. The 6-pack, I find I need more aileron than I normally expect, and that's actually a good thing because that's how the actual aircraft is going to behave, where you actually need to put a deliberate aileron motion to get the plane rolling. Buttons on the simulator may not respond immediately. And this is just because of the way that's set up. I have basically a screen that I can swap in and swap out depending on the configuration that we're looking for. So depending on how tightly I tighten the screws on the corners, the contacts behind from the computer board to the acrylic screen that I'm installing might not be as flush as I would want them to be. So when you start moving knobs, sometimes slower is better because it's a better reading. If you suddenly flip a switch or rotate a dial very quickly, it might not respond the way that you expect. So just take your time. Range of motion in the simulator is quite limited. It does have a little bit of pitch, bank, and yaw, but it's nothing too extreme. You may feel some lateral movement during operation, but pitch and bank should be negligible. And the other thing too is that I can turn the motion on and off. So the first time that we get in there, if we're doing things like VMC rolls or other aggressive, unusual attitudes, I may elect to turn the motion off just so I don't exceed the limitations of the simulator. However, in normal IFR training, then we'll usually keep it on just to get comfortable with the feeling of it. Motion sickness is unlikely because it's a very gentle pitching and rolling and kind of stuff. But if you do feel unwell, let me know. We'll pause. I can always pause the simulator at any time and you can get out, stretch your legs. That is the other nice thing about, I encourage people to use the simulator, even for those that have their own aircraft and that they want to do IFR training on it. Using the simulator is great because I have the ability to pause, so I can take stock of the situation. I can draw a little picture and say, here's where we are, and talk about what the next thing to do would be. Whereas if we're on a real aircraft, I don't have the ability to do that. I can't just pause things. And it means that things have to be a little more rushed usually than I would really like. We can simulate a range of locations and environments. In practice, we're only going to really use the Regina Airport to do our training here. Now, the nice thing about the simulator is that I can actually do approaches that are no longer active. So recently, there were a pair of NDBs that were decommissioned. They're no longer in existence out there. However, the simulator doesn't know that. No one told the simulator that these NDBs got decommissioned. So we can actually do things like NDB approaches in Regina, which are no longer possible. It's not really good training because there's no point training an approach that you're not going to do. But for like an introduction to the kind of practice or things like procedure turns, it could be useful. So that's the nice thing about it. But we can move the simulator to any airport. I haven't really done much of that myself. We mostly stay in the Regina area, but it has the capability. Tuning navigation aids. Now the simulator, it does a fantastic job with simulating line of sight, which is kind of surprising for something that's basically, it's a Microsoft flight simulator visuals that are used there. So on the ground, if you're trying to do things like tune and identify the Lumsden VOR, and you say, you can't do that. It's too far away, you're too low, you don't have line of sight. So if we're going to be taxiing out and we want to check things like the accuracy of our HSI needles, so the accuracy of our ground-based nav aids, we generally use the localizer signal. So we would tune and identify the localizer, listen to the Morse code, and then taxi up to the apron. And then when we take position on the runway, we'll do this if it's in the real aircraft as well. Before taking position, I would request tower and say, tower, this is Golf Papa Zulu Oscar, holding short runway 13 on Bravo, we're ready for takeoff, requesting a momentary stop on the runway. And then what they would do is it's okay, momentary stop approved, line up, take position, runway 13. And on that 30 seconds or so that we take position, we'll do a quick check of our HSI needle, confirm that the localizer signal is centered. And now that I'm happy with it, then I can set for whatever my en route departure is going to be. And this is great because it works for runway 31 as well. Even though you're on the far side of the runway, you should still be on a center localizer. And even when you're taking position on runway 26, the intersection there should pass you right through the localizer. So different situations where you can check your localizer signal. Autopilot, I'm of two minds about this. So let's talk about it in the simulator first. So in the simulator, the autopilot is available. Initially, when I started training people on the Redbird FMX, I was actually pretty discouraging of using the autopilot because I've had some negative experiences myself where I've had autopilots try to kill me in real life, and that's no joke. You can program it as well as you can in real life, but sometimes the brains of the autopilot just get scrambled and it starts doing its own thing. So you have to kick it off, and learning how to disengage an autopilot is an important skill. So but in training, we'll use it when necessary. So in straight and level phases of flight, if I want to get you to focus more on programming the hold or getting the approach set up, we can use the autopilot as necessary. In real life, the autopilot on Papa Zulu Oscar or Piper Seneca is not that great. Usually what you'll find is that it'll hold plus or minus 50 feet. Usually when you just engage the autopilot, there is a bit of drift down that takes place. So having a slightly higher altitude than you need when you engage it is useful. So if I want to hold a 4,000 foot altitude, climb the aircraft up to 4,050 feet, engage the autopilot, and it will gently just kind of sink to that 4,000. It will hold you there. The autopilot in the in the actual aircraft does a reasonable job with holding heading and altitude. Beyond that, it can't shoot approaches. You have to pretty much do those yourself. So you have to kick it off and fly. And you never use the autopilot when you are doing engine failure scenarios. So you'll always be hand flying in those situations. If you do want to disengage the autopilot, I keep using my thumb with a button there. There is a button on the yoke to disengage the autopilot. That's the autopilot trim disconnect button. It's a big red button in the simulator. It should be a big red button in the actual aircraft as well, but for whatever reason, it's a big yellow button. Someone needs to repaint that thing, if you ask me. So that's how you kick that off. And that's if you have any problems whatsoever with the autopilot, that's the first thing that you do. The other thing too is there is a button in the simulator at least to kick off the autopilot too, but I always recommend the one on the yoke since that should be a little bit easier. And the examiner can fail the autopilot as part of your flight test. He says, nope, you can't use it. So it forced you to hand fly the entire thing. In practice, though, I think he also recognizes the benefit of using the autopilot. So I don't think he hasn't been telling people that they've been unable to do it, which is nice. We will say in the simulator, do not touch the screens because the oils on your fingers will leave a residue, and it's almost impossible to clean off just with the texture of those screens. They're kind of special screens, so don't touch the screens. Also, don't leave things on the dash of the simulator, at least, because for the same reason, we don't want you accidentally touching the screen at the 12 o'clock position. In the actual aircraft, we do use the dash to put our checklist. So we have a checklist that we put basically above the dash against the window on the side for quick access to draw and push back. So that will be used in the real plane. Continue on. Other common sense things, stay clear of the sim while it is in operation. Now, lately I have had Turbo, one of our hangar cats, has been jumping in the simulator while it's been in motion. And for his safety, that he doesn't get caught in any pinch points, I will, if I see that, I will probably pause the sim right away and usher him out, because I don't want him to get hurt, because the simulator does move around, and unfortunately he's not smart enough to recognize the threat. No more than 2 at a time inside the simulator. No food or drink inside the simulator as well. The simulator may occasionally crash. In my experience, if it does, it usually comes back within about 10 to 15 seconds. So you just got to wait for the visuals to return, and then things come back to normal. And the sim only gets charged while the simulator is basically running. And now let me go in more details on how the expenses and the charges work here. So if we're doing the pre-flight brief, we're just talking about what the lesson is going to be. Even though the simulator might be powered on, you're not getting charged for that. It's not until you actually get in there, and then the plane is in a certain location, either on the runway or in flight. That's when the clock is running, when the visuals for the sim are present. Now, even when we're paused, however, the clock is still rolling. So just be aware of that. So just because I'm pausing to talk about something, that doesn't mean like, oh, the clock is stopped and I can go get lunch and go get some, go to the bathroom. That's not the purpose of the pause. The pause is just to give us the benefit to talk about what's going on. But even in pause, the clock does run. I use the pausing feature as necessary. Really depends on the student. So, you know, if I have to pause it, then I have to pause it. So be it. I won't drag it out by any means. I'm not going to sit there and read you a story or anything like that. But we'll talk about the important things that are relevant to the exercise. Like I said, we do have multiple configurations. We can do classic instrumentation. We can do G1000. Now, if there are simulator sessions that are back to back, and I need to reconfigure the sim, give me about 10 or 15 minutes to do that, because it does take me some time to swap the screen out, put another screen back in. I also have to swap the control, that actually the throttle quadrant. So this would be the in the picture here, the single engine throttle quadrant, but I do have a multi-engine as well. So it takes time to set that up. So just be patient with me. And because of the COVID procedures, we do wipe down the simulator between each student. So make sure it's all sanitary. So that takes some time as well. Just be patient. I used to do this. I'm kind of going away from that. I have my own scripts that I use in terms of what we're going to cover, and I make sure that I brief you before then. So sometimes a script, you'll go into it, you'll know exactly everything that we're going to do, especially in the initial stages of your IFR, so that it's not a surprise. We can talk about what to expect and make it go as smoothly as possible. As we continue on in the training, you're getting closer to a flight test, it's going to be surprises all the way along. I might tell you what departure procedure you can expect, but after that, it's going to be a surprise. And this is where the challenge comes in, because if I tell you everything that's going to happen, it just makes it too easy. And that's not what's going to be taking place on the flight test. However, if you do have questions, always ask them before the ride, because I'd rather save you the trouble of making the mistake during the ride and then having to redo an exercise because something wasn't understood. Now, how to log. So first thing I'll say is that the simulator itself does not contribute towards your total flight time. So if you've got 100 hours total and you do an hour of sim, you've still got 100 hours of total. So that doesn't change that. However, it does contribute towards your instrument time. So remember what I said before, saying you need 40 hours of total instrument time, of which 20 can be in a ground-based simulator. So this would contribute towards the simulator time. And you can count it as either sim. Usually there's a category in the logbooks for that. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Now, when you're logging this in your logbook, so the aircraft type is Redbird FMX. The call sign, if you're doing a single engine, is going to be 698-01. And I say Cessna 182 because that's what the model variant is that's in the simulator. If you're in any kind of multi, whether it's a glass or whether it's classic instrumentation, 698-02 is how you would log that. And if you're doing your IFR flight check, your IPC for your renewal, you would log that as 698-03. So those are the 3 different call signs that this simulator can have. These are not considered dual lessons, but you'll still have, you'll say myself or your instructor as the pilot in command, you as the student. In the comment section, you can say what you did. And usually the best way to describe is specifically, I did the Tango 678 departure, I did a hold at NADAP, I did the ILS runway 13, and I did a single engine RNAV runway 26. Like I would go through that kind of detail because that's what I'm going to be recording in your PTR as well. And so if there's ever confusion about things to practice, and I can look back either in your logbook or the PTR usually, and I can see, okay, here's the things that we've been really practicing. Maybe let's try something different here today so that we can get the full spectrum of things that could be covered on the flight test. I will say though that the ILS and the localizer runway 13 are going to be pretty much on every flight. And the purpose for that is because on your IPC, I just got a frozen screen again. I hope it came back. Anyways, on your IPC, if you look at the aviation circular, which goes into detail about what needs to be covered in that ride, it says that you need to do a ground-based non-precision approach. And here in Regina, the only one that we have for that is the localizer runway 13. Now, like just for your familiarity, if you're not from the Regina area, we've got 4 different runways. You've got runway 08, 13, 26, and 31. For 3 of those runways, 08, 26, and 31, the only approach that we have available to us is the GPS approach, the RNAV approach. Now, there's 2 different RNAV approaches, actually. There's an RNAV Zulu and an RNAV Yankee. We are not permitted to do the RNAV Yankee approaches here in Regina because those are something called RNP approaches, which the easy way of describing that is it's a GPS approach that has curved paths as opposed to straight paths between points. So we're not training for that. So anytime we load up an approach that's GPS based in Regina, it'll always be the Zulu. But we only have GPS approaches on those 3 runways. The only other runway is runway 13, and that's the only runway that we have either an ILS or a localizer to. And because you need to do on your initial IFR rating, you need to do an ILS ground-based approach with precision minima, so that is the ILS. On your recurrent, an IPC, the requirement is to do a non-precision ground-based navigation, so a localizer. So to sum that up, in your initial group 1 or group 3, you will do the ILS. And then the second approach that you're going to do will be a non-precision GPS of some kind. It could be non-precision 26 or the RNAV 26, or it could be the non-precision 08. If you're doing a renewal, you're guaranteed to get the localizer runway 13, do the MIST approach or whatever sequence they do. And then the next approach you would do would be the precision GPS approach. So that's the 2 ways to look at that, which is nice. And the other thing too, with a multi-engine group 1, one of those approaches is going to be the single engine approach. So if the examiner is feeling particularly nasty, they can make it so that the first approach is really easy. Oh, you get to do the ILS runway 13. And then the second approach, like, okay, it's going to be the GPS, non-precision, single engine approach. So we'll make sure that we train for all that and that you're ready for it, but that's the possibility. Any questions? Now, I'll end this by saying that if you have any questions, come to me. As your primary instructor, I'm more than happy to talk about these things. But what I'd like to do now, I do have a little bit of time. I'm probably going to be heading out soon, so I won't have time to do the total presentation I'd like to do. But I'm going to stop the share, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up the iPad and just kind of talk about. Actually, I'm going to end the presentation here. I'll make a new presentation soon. So hopefully that was useful, and hope you enjoyed.